William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament from Yorkshire, addressed the House of Commons to give an impassioned address calling for the end of the slave trade throughout the British colonies. Wilberforce began by admitting his inadequacy and his temerity. He said, quote, "When I consider the magnitude of the subject which I am to bring before the House, a subject in which the interests not of this country nor of Europe alone, but of the whole world and of posterity are involved, and when I think at the same time on the weakness of the advocate who has undertaken this great cause, when these reflections press upon my mind, it is impossible for me not to feel both terrified and concerned at my own inadequacy to such a task. But when I reflect, however, on the encouragement which I have had through the whole course of a long and laborious examination on this question, and how much candor I have experienced and how conviction has increased within my own mind in proportion as I have advanced in my labors, when I reflect especially that however averse any gentleman may now be, yet we shall all be of one opinion in the end, when I turn myself to these thoughts, I take courage. I determine to forget all other fears, and I march forward with a firmer step in the full assurance that my cause will bear me out, that I shall be able to justify upon the clearest principles every resolution in my hand, which is the avowed end and total abolition of the slave trade." Wilberforce then implicated himself and the rest of Parliament in the slave trade, for even if they did not own slaves themselves, they had permitted the trade to continue when they had the power to stop it. He said, "I mean not to accuse anyone, but to take the shame upon myself in common indeed with the whole Parliament of Great Britain for having suffered this horrid trade to be carried on under their authority. We are all guilty. We ought all to plead guilty and not to exculpate ourselves by throwing blame on others. I therefore deprecate every kind of reflection against the various descriptions of people who are more immediately involved in this wretched business." In the speech, Wilberforce argued against the evils of the slave trade on the basis that it exploited the African peoples rather than aiding them. Does not everyone see that a slave trade carried on around her coasts must carry violence and desolation to their very center? It treats human beings as a commodity and invites them to, quote, "ravage human beings as goods," end quote. There is no African legislature to protect and defend the rights of the African people. The slave trade naturally tends to tempt African kings to avarice or greed and sensuality as they enrich themselves by selling their own people as goods. Wilberforce said, "Does the king of Barbessin, that is an African kingdom, does he want brandy? He has only to send his troops in the nighttime to burn and desolate a village. The captives will serve as commodities that may be bartered with the British trader." Wilberforce maintained that the slave trade was the chief cause of all wars in Africa. He said the treatment of the African slaves is appalling, far beneath the dignity demanded by their common humanity. "I verily believe, therefore, if the wretchedness of any one of the many hundred Africans stowed in every ship could be brought before their view and remain within the sight of the African merchant, that there is no one among them whose heart could bear it. Let anyone imagine to himself 600-700 of these wretches chained 2 and 2, surrounded with every object that is nauseous and disgusting, diseased, and struggling under every kind of wretchedness." And then the mortality rate of the slaves, when all factors are considered, approaches 50%. He wrote, "It will be found upon an average of all the ships of which evidence has been given at the Privy Council that exclusive of those who perish before they set sail, not less than 12.5% perish in the course of the passage. Besides these, the Jamaica report tells you that not less than 4.5% die on shore before the day of sail, which is only a week or two from the time of landing. 1/3 more will die in the seasoning, and this in a country exactly like their own. The diseases, however, which they contract on shipboard, the astringent washes, which are to hide their wounds, and the mischievous tricks used to make them up for sale are, as the Jamaica report says, one principal cause of this mortality. Upon the whole, however, here is a mortality of about 50%, and this among Africans who are not bought unless quite healthy at the first, and unless, as the phrase is, with cattle, they are sound in wind and limb. How then can the house refuse its belief to the multiplied testimonies before the Privy Council of the savage treatment of the Africans in the Middle Passage? Nay, indeed, what need is there of any further evidence? The number of deaths speaks for itself and makes all such inquiry superfluous. As soon as ever I had arrived thus far in my investigation of the slave trade, I confess to you, sir, so enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did its wickedness appear that my own mind was completely made up for the abolition. A trade founded in iniquity and carried on as this was must be abolished. Let the policy be what it might, let the consequences be what they would. I from this time determined that I would never rest till I had effected its abolition. What a speech. Wilberforce did not know when he made that promise not to rest until the slave trade was abolished that he would wait some 18 years for the bill to pass. Year after year, he proposed the abolition bill, and year after year it was defeated or delayed by parliamentary tactics and thinly veiled compromise bills. When England went to the brink of war with France, the abolition movement lost public support as abolition was linked in the public mind with the French Revolution. Public support then began to increase in the first years of the 1800s, but still the bill could not gain the votes that it needed to pass. In 1806, Wilberforce published his magnum opus entitled A Letter on the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which was written to his Yorkshire constituents back home. This letter is in actuality a 400-page treatise, a comprehensive restatement of the abolitionist case. Finally, on the strength of this renewed fervor, the abolition bill passed on February 23, 1807, by a vote of 283 to 16. Wilberforce sat while the vote was cast, tears streaming down his face. He then turned his attention to ensuring that the government enforced the bill and fighting for the total emancipation of all slaves throughout the empire. On July 26, 1833, the House of Commons passed the bill on the abolition of slavery, and Wilberforce died 3 days later at the age of 73. A letter on the abolition of the slave trade. In that book, in that treatise, Wilberforce deals with the objection that was common in his day and is still to be found today in certain corners of American evangelicalism, that slavery was not and is not a moral evil because God condoned slavery in the Old Testament. And Paul appears to condone it in the New. Wilberforce wrote, the only argument which they urge with the slightest color of reason is that slavery was allowed under the Jewish dispensation. The Jews were exalted by the express designation of heaven to a state of eminence above the strangers who sojourned among them, and the heathen who dwelt around them, from either of whom, as a mark of their own dominion, God, who has a right to assign to all his creatures their several places in the scale of being, allowed them to take bondmen and bondwomen, treating them, however, with kindness, remembering their own feelings when they were slaves in Egypt, and admitting them to the chief national privileges, to the circumcision, to the Passover, and to other solemn feasts, and thus instructing them in the true religion. Besides this, the slaves were to be set free at the year of Jubilee, or every 50th year, a command which alone was sufficient to prevent their accumulating in any great number. But they who thus urge on us the divine toleration of slavery under the Jewish theocracy should remember that the Jews themselves were expressly commanded not to retain any of their own nation, any of their brethren in slavery, except as a punishment or by their own consent. And even these were to be set free on the return of the sabbatical or the 7th year. Inasmuch, therefore, as we are repeatedly and expressly told that Christ has done away with all such distinctions of nations and made all mankind one great family, all our fellow creatures are now our brethren. And therefore, the very principles and spirit of the Jewish law itself would forbid our keeping the Africans any more than our own fellow subjects in a state of slavery. But even supposing, contrary to fact, that our opponents had succeeded in proving that the slave trade was not contrary to the Jewish law, this would only prove that they were entitled to carry it on if they were in fact Jews, and could, like the Jews, produce satisfactory proof that they were the chosen people of God. But really, it would be consuming your time to no purpose to enter into a formal proof that fraud, plunder, and cruelty, as contrary to that religion which commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves and to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. I cannot persuade myself that our opponents are serious in using this argument, and therefore I will proceed no farther with this discussion. Besides, even granting that it were possible for any of them to be seriously convinced that Christianity does not prohibit the slave trade, I should still have no great encouragement to proceed, for it may be prejudice, but I cannot persuade myself that they are so much under the practical influence of religion that if we should convince their understandings, that we should alter their conduct. And just in case you're trying to sift through Wilberforce's 19th century language, which can be somewhat obscure to our ears, yes, he is in fact calling into question the sincerity of the profession of faith of anyone who would argue in favor of the slave trade. The question I would like to address at the outset of this sermon then, before I actually begin to exposit these verses, is whether William Wilberforce had greater moral clarity than the Apostle Paul. When we open up today's text, Ephesians 6, 5 through 9, we find Paul exhorting slaves to obey their masters, and masters to treat their slaves with kindness and impartiality. We find ourselves asking, especially in light of this immortal speech, sections of which I've read to you from Wilberforce, we find ourselves asking, why doesn't Paul likewise seize this opportunity to rail against the evils of slavery? Why doesn't he discourse on inalienable rights and provide slaves with a moral justification for escaping their bondage? Why doesn't he command Christian masters to emancipate their slaves as part of their submission to Christ? Why does he appear to treat slavery as a human institution right alongside marriage, Ephesians 5, 22 to 33, and family, Ephesians 6, 1 to 4? In 1 Peter 3:15, we are exhorted to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. It's the task of apologetics, making a defense of the Christian faith. And apologetics is a part of our calling as believers and as a church. And in our culture, one of the most pressing questions we face is why the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn slavery, but in fact appears to condone it. Many will grant, if they've actually read the Bible and are not outright hostile towards Christianity, that the Bible places clear moral constraints upon slaveholders, instructing them to stop threatening their slaves, Ephesians 6:9, to treat their slaves justly and fairly, Colossians 4:1, and to do so as those who will themselves be judged by their master in heaven. But this still falls far short of calling for the total abolition of slavery. So what gives? Is this a biblical blind spot like our culture is telling us? Do we, sitting here in 21st century Nixa, have greater moral clarity than the biblical authors? Or, as some have insinuated on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps slavery is not actually as evil as we've been led to believe. My answer to both of those insinuations is God forbid. Let's begin by dismissing one common approach to answering this charge that the Bible lacks moral clarity regarding the issue of slavery. It is common to hear evangelicals defend the Bible's treatment of slavery by claiming that slavery in the first century Greco-Roman world was essentially equivalent to modern-day employment. In other words, so it is claimed, the relationship between the slave and the master was similar to the relationship between the employee and the employer. Thus, it is implied the slavery of which Paul speaks was nothing like the chattel slavery in the antebellum South. The slavery Paul is addressing is more like what we see on Downton Abbey than what we saw in Roots. This is not a good defense of the biblical position on slavery because it's just not true. Slavery in the Greco-Roman world existed on a broad spectrum from something that was in fact akin to modern employment and apprenticeship on the one hand, all the way to the very worst abuses of chattel slavery in the antebellum South on the other. Slaves had no rights. They had no recourse to legal protections. There was no one to whom they may appeal if they were being abused. Therefore, their well-being was utterly and completely at the mercy of their masters. Those whose masters viewed it as an honorable thing to treat their slaves justly would generally fare well and could justly be compared to modern-day employees. But those whose masters were violent and capricious and lecherous were subject to all manner of dehumanizing abuses. S.M. Baugh writes that even though, quote, slavery in antiquity was not restricted to any particular ethnic group, it was sometimes just as brutal and exploitative, end quote. Ephesus was, in fact, home to an important wholesale slave market which distributed slaves to the entire Western Roman districts. It's been estimated that slaves would have comprised roughly 1/3 of the population of a city like Ephesus. Some estimates place the number of slaves in the entire Roman Empire at 60 million. And slaves came from 5 principal sources: prisoners of war and citizens of conquered nations, never any shortage of those; children of slaves who then became the property of their slave owner; those who sold themselves into slavery to pay off debt or escape starvation; unwanted infants. They were known as foundlings, who were exposed by their parents, abandoned by their parents, and picked up and raised to be slaves; and then those who were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Only one of those 5 sources was voluntary. Clearly, then, the argument that the first century slave is analogous to the modern employee is impossible to sustain. It wasn't. So don't use that argument. It's not a good one. So how are we to explain the absence of an explicit condemnation of the institution of slavery? Well, obviously, such a complex ethical question demands a book-length argument, but for our purposes today, I'm going to offer you 5 responses to this charge of a lack of moral clarity on the issue. Response number 1 is this: by forbidding masters to threaten, let alone abuse their slaves, Ephesians 6:9, by commanding them to treat their slaves justly and fairly, Colossians 4:1, and by reminding them of their accountability before God for how they act toward their slaves, the Apostle Paul effectively made the institution of slavery, at least as it was practiced within the Christian household, far more similar to our modern concept of employment than slavery as it was practiced outside of Christian households and in the antebellum South. Every imaginable horror associated with slavery is prohibited by those words, justly and fairly, Colossians 4:1. Now, Christian masters are bound by covenant to love their slaves as themselves, Mark 12:31, Romans 13:8-10, Galatians 5:14, to treat them as they would want to be treated, Matthew 7:12. Within Christian households, slavery as we know it would functionally cease to exist. The only difference between a Christian slave of a Christian master and a Christian employee of a Christian employer would be that the Christian employee possesses a greater degree of vocational autonomy than the Christian slave. But though the slave is bound by law to his master, an employee, I would remind us, is just as bound oftentimes to his employer by economic or industrial factors. Nobody is completely autonomous. Nobody possesses ultimate self-determination. My second response is that by placing these instructions to Christian masters within the context of an authoritative apostolic letter to the entire church, Paul is placing Christian masters under the authority and the accountability of the church for the way that they treat their slaves. So if a Christian slave owner were to treat his slaves abusively or unjustly or unfairly, he would be subject then to the judgment and the discipline of the church, to which Jesus has granted the keys of the kingdom. That is the authority to speak for God on earth. Matthew 16, Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5. In other words, no longer after this letter does what happens in the home stay in the home. In all of these various household relationships, that of the husband and the wife, that of the parent and the child, that of the master and the slave, Paul has now brought them out of the darkness, out from behind closed doors, and into the light, and invited the accountability and the judgment of the church upon them. The church then is invited to function as a kind of regulatory watchdog over the institution of slavery as it was practiced by church members. Christian slave owners ignore these instructions at the peril of their own soul. And this is a powerful curb on the horrors of slavery. My third response, even though Paul does not command the abolition of slavery, even though he neither commands Christian masters to emancipate their slaves nor permits Christian slaves to run away from their Christian masters, he does encourage, I might add, slaves to pursue liberation through legal means. 1 Corinthians 7:21. Let each one stay in the state in which he was called. However, if you are a slave and can obtain your freedom, then do that. Yet throughout his writings, the Apostle Paul, as well as the rest of the New Testament authors, they're everywhere just liberally sowing the seeds of abolition, which then Wilberforce is reaping the fruit of. Think of the following truths from the pen of the Apostle Paul. Acts 17, and he made from one man to every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. No one can read the Apostle Paul and justify slavery on the basis of racial or ethnic or national superiority. According to Paul, all men are equal in creation. Or Ephesians 2, and you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. So no one can read the Apostle Paul and justify slavery on the basis that some people groups are more wicked than others. All men are equal in condemnation. Or Galatians 3, 28 and 29, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. 1 Corinthians 12:12. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one spirit. No one can read the Apostle Paul and justify slavery on the basis that some people have more claim to Christ and more of a share of the everlasting inheritance than others. All men are equal in the redemption that is in Christ. I submit to you then that a Christian slave owner who believes these truths, who comes to the gathered assembly for worship where, if that worship is being conducted rightly, and take note of the fact that Paul assumes that believing slaves will be in the gathered assembly right alongside their believing masters to hear the apostolic word. In such a worship where there is no segregation of Jew or Gentile or male or female or slave or free, but all are singing together, gathered together, to hear the word together, to partake of the Lord's Supper together, without any partiality or any favoritism, if that's the way their church is functioning and that's the way it's designed to function, then this Christian slave owner is eventually going to find it impossible to continue to justify the practice of slavery, even under the best of conditions. Now, churches have not always lived out these truths. Philip Ryken writes in his commentary on Galatians about Presbyterians in the antebellum South. He says, in those days it was customary for Presbyterian elders to give their parishioners tokens signifying that they were eligible to participate in the Lord's Supper. Sadly, in some churches, African slaves were not given the customary silver token, but one made of base metal. Nor were they allowed to receive the sacrament until all the white church members had been served. This was a divisive and prejudicial way of handling a sacrament that God intends to signify our union together in Christ. Whether the elders believed the gospel or not, their actions clearly denied it. In other words, I'm suggesting that if a church proclaims the gospel, if its members believe the gospel in time, and it frequently takes generations for deeply ingrained patterns of sin to see widespread mortification, but in time, these churches and these Christians will abolish slavery in their midst. And I'm not alone in arguing this way. John Stott wrote, nevertheless, we Christians cannot escape a sense of shame that slavery and the slave trade were tolerated for so long, especially later in the European colonies. Both should have been abolished centuries before they were. And the best Christian minds recognize this. Calvin, for example, in the middle of the 16th century, attributed slavery to original sin. He deduced it to be a thing totally against all the order of nature, that human beings fashioned after the image of God should ever be put to such reproach, end quote. Stott says, while we cannot defend the indolence and cowardice of 2 further Christian centuries which saw this social evil but failed to eradicate it, we can at the same time rejoice that the gospel immediately began, even in the 1st century, to undermine the institution. It lit a fuse which at long last led to the explosion which destroyed it. Similarly, Brian Chappell writes, quote, with inspired wisdom, the apostle enables the gospel to progress in a society that approves slavery while, at the same time, planting seeds for its destruction. Similar steps are evident in the book of Philemon, where the apostle does not command a master to release his slave, but rather to think of him as Paul's son, Philemon 10, to treat him as a dear brother, Philemon 16. Elsewhere, Paul reminds all that he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman, 1 Corinthians 7:22. Thus, it is apparent in the households where Paul's instructions for masters and slaves were followed that the bonds of slavery were broken and that the freedom of Christ would, and I might add, eventually reign. 4th response. We must remember the context in which Paul ministered and the purpose for which Paul wrote. Paul was not a Roman senator. He was not on the Ephesian city council. He wasn't even an Ephesian. And he was writing a letter to a church that comprised, at most, 0.01% of the population of Ephesus, if the church had 250 members. What good would it have done for Paul to launch into a diatribe about the inherent evils of slavery? The church had zero political clout. Its influence over Ephesian culture was insignificant. Furthermore, as a number of commentators have noted, slavery was so ingrained in the fabric of 1st century Greco-Roman society that to argue for the total abolition of the institution of slavery would have been perceived as working for the total disintegration of society. Baugh, for instance, wonders what would happen if slavery were suddenly rather than incrementally abolished in the 1st century world. He says slavery was not an incidental feature of the ancient agrarian economies of the 1st century, but was part of its essential fabric. Even if a Roman emperor were to outlaw slavery by decree, there would be unimaginable inflation when newly freed farm workers, especially from the Roman plantations, which often employed chained slaves, when they would enter the urban workforce without skills or training for the relatively few craft jobs that were available. Farms would stand vacant, and starvation and food riots would be the norm. This is not by any means to justify ancient slavery, but Paul would have been most irresponsible and imprudent if he had simply spoken out against it and inspired Christians to social revolution. In any case, it was not Paul's purpose, nor was it the purpose of any of the other apostles to tell their church members how to live in an ideal society, but rather to instruct Christians how to live faithfully in a corrupt society in which they lived. The New Testament is written to exiles living in Babylon in these present evil days. It is written neither to the Babylonians nor to the saints who are already living in Zion in the age to come. The New Testament does not aim first at cultural transformation. Rather, it aims at gospel transformation of individuals. Then it sends those so transformed by the gospel out to live as lights in the world and salt in the earth, like Wilberforce. Now, this does not account for why Paul does not command Christian masters to emancipate their slaves. I think that's answered by the fact that to do so in this social context would have been to condemn most of them to unemployment and poverty and starvation. Under this heading of the context in which Paul wrote, I might add two further factors. The first is that at least some who existed on that vast spectrum of first century slavery enjoyed ample opportunity to obtain their freedom. This certainly was not true of all slaves, but perhaps it was true of those in the Ephesian church, and that might account for why Paul does not command Christian masters to emancipate their slaves. And the second factor is that by God's common grace, the regulation of slavery increased through Roman legislature throughout the first century, such that slaves enjoyed many more protections by the end of the century than did by the first. Maybe Paul saw that things were changing, and that might at least provide some nuance to the New Testament's lack of an explicit condemnation of slavery. The final response that I would make is this: securing the temporal, earthly emancipation of Christian slaves is simply not the New Testament's highest aim. Ensuring that a Christian is treated with the dignity owed him as an image bearer of God, ensuring a Christian's access to his so-called inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you're quoting Jefferson, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, if you're quoting Locke. That's simply not the New Testament's ultimate goal. And this is why so many people, Americans especially, have such trouble accepting some of the Bible's teachings. For the Bible consistently exhorts us to forego temporary pleasures and freedoms in order that they might gain eternal joys and freedoms. For instance, consider 1 Peter 2:18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, and not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. So this instruction in 1 Peter 2 makes no sense if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this life is God's ultimate purpose for you. If that were the case, then the slave of an unjust master should run away or revolt. But God sets his sights higher, and so must we. He aims at our eternal life, liberty, and happiness, and that of innumerable others. What if, the believing slave thinks, what if God has providentially placed me in this home under this unjust master in order that by my patient and joyful suffering, I might obtain the salvation of my master and of the rest of the household, not to mention multiplied joy myself in the day of resurrection? This is not to say that slavery is not an evil fruit of an evil society. It is. It's not to say that a slave should not pursue his freedom using all legitimate means. He should. It is simply to say that personal, temporal happiness is not the highest aim of the New Testament, and it shouldn't be the highest aim of the Christian. And so when these two aims come into conflict, my freedom and happiness in this life or the freedom and happiness of myself and potentially others eternally, the Christian joyfully chooses the latter over the former. And this may be a further reason why Paul and Peter instructs Christian slaves to render faithful service to their masters rather than run away from them, even those who are unjust. So, circle back. Did William Wilberforce have greater moral clarity on the issue of slavery than the Apostle Paul? No. They were two very different men living in two very different times. Paul was an apostle who was laying the foundation of the church and was establishing its doctrine. And it fell to him to teach the saints of his day how to live faithfully as a minority people in a majority pagan world. William Wilberforce, on the other hand, was a member of Parliament with political power, as well as a member of a church and a citizen of a nation that purported to believe the gospel and yet took part in the exploitation and massacre of African peoples. It fell to Wilberforce in his day to confront his church and his nation with the implications of the gospel that Paul had set forth. Both the Apostle Paul and William Wilberforce believed the same gospel, but they were called to apply it to two very different contexts. Yet isn't it interesting that Wilberforce thought Paul was on his side in the debate rather than on the side of the slave owners? He used his writings to great effect in the cause of abolition. Far from being at odds on the issue of slavery, William Wilberforce was deeply and profoundly shaped by the Apostle Paul, and in effect, I would argue, finished the work of abolition that Paul had begun. Now, this has been an apologetic sermon, for which I make no apology. My aim has been to provide a nuanced defense of the Christian faith against what is a common accusation, especially over the last 5 years, that the Bible condones slavery by failing to condemn it. Silence is violence, we're told so often. But I want to conclude this sermon by making application of this text to this church. And since, bless God, we live in a society where slavery is no longer legal, we may draw from this text principles that do, in fact, translate into the workplace. Because while 21st century employment and first century slavery are not identical, there is some overlap to how employees should relate to their employers and how employers should treat their employees. So let me take 5 minutes each to address first those of us who are employees and then those of us who are employers. First, a word to employees, to those in the subordinate position in this work relationship. Verse 5, bondservants, employees. Obey your earthly masters, employers, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. The underlying factor in Paul's instructions to both Christian slaves and Christian masters is that both of them are equally slaves of Jesus. The supremacy of Christ informs the way the Christian slave relates to his master and the way the Christian master relates to his slave. So, as we translate Paul's instructions out of the context of slavery and into the context of employment, the application to Christian employees is this: you are called to serve Christ by serving your employer. You are called to serve Christ by serving your employer. In all aspects of your work, you are to look beyond your human employer, your human manager, and you are to see Christ. Your labor, your service is ultimately rendered to Him. So how then should you approach your job Tuesday morning, assuming you're off tomorrow? You should serve your employer with reverence first. with fear and trembling. In 2 Corinthians 7:15, the Apostle Paul uses this exact phrase to describe the way the Corinthians received Titus, who had been sent to them as Paul's representative. It's not that the Corinthians were afraid of Titus. They didn't cower in his presence. It's rather that they recognized that Titus represented Paul, and they reverenced Paul's apostolic authority over them. And the same is true of your relationship to your employer. Your employer, whether we're talking about the owner of the business or the manager who is directly in authority over you, he or she represents Jesus to you. You should obey him as you would Christ, with all of the reasonable and implied restrictions that we've noted of the wife's obedience to her husbands and the children's obedience to their parents. That is, you should obey your employer when he or she is acting in good faith within the sphere of his or her delegated authority. You should not obey him or her in anything illegal or immoral. So examine yourself this morning. Do you reverence your employer or your manager as a representative of Christ? Secondly, you should serve your employer with integrity, with a sincere heart, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, doing the will of God from the heart. Each of those phrases points to a correlation between what is external and visible and what is internal and secret. So it's not enough in Paul's mind to do what is assigned. Your obedience must flow from a heart that reverences your employer as a delegate of Christ. Neither is it sufficient to labor diligently only when it can be observed and therefore rewarded. The quality of your labor must not depend on whether or not you are being observed and evaluated, or else you are condemned by Paul as a man-pleaser, and your labor, far from being worthy of reward, is mere eye service, a word apparently coined by the Apostle Paul. So examine yourself by this. Do you perform your work with integrity and excellence all the time, performing your duty in the same manner that you would as though the Lord himself had assigned the task? Third, you should serve your employer with benevolence, literally with a good will. It's what benevolence means, a good will. How do you view your boss? Do you perceive him or her as the enemy or as a co-laborer in a good work? Now notice, I didn't ask how your boss perceives you, whether he or she perceives you as a co-laborer. That's immaterial. Whatever work you do, if it is a good work, it serves the common good by God's common grace. And if your work doesn't serve the common good by God's common grace, that is, if it's either illegal or immoral, you should quit your job and find another. But whether you're teaching students how to read and write and think, or writing code for an e-commerce engine, or designing belts for cars that last longer and work better, or nursing sick people back to health, or providing industries with moldable plastic, it's a good work. And your boss is a co-laborer with you in that good work, and he deserves, therefore, your goodwill. So examine yourself by this. Do you want your employer to succeed? Do you see his or her success as a part of the common good for which you all strive? Do you will good for him or her? Fourth, you should serve your employer in faith, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. So what if your employer is unjust? What if he's a jerk? What if there is no reciprocity for approaching work in this way? What if you earn no more money and you receive no more recognition if you give 100% effort than if you give 65% effort? What then? The Christian employee continues to give maximum effort in order to achieve maximum excellence. Why? Because the Christian employee lives and works by faith and not by sight. Faith in what? Faith in the promise that God is not so unjust as to forget the good that we have done. Faith that God sees our maximum effort even when it goes unrecognized by anyone else. Faith that God will surely reward those who labor for him, whether he is a bondservant or is free. God sees, God will reward. And this truth redeems all of our labor from the frustration and futility of the curse. There is no wasted effort when it is expended for the Lord. He rewards every service rendered to him. So examine yourself. Do you believe this? How would it change the way you approach your job on Tuesday morning if you walked into your place of work believing that God will see and reward every good work you do that day? Finally, you should serve your employer as an act of worship to the glory of God. How many times does Paul emphasize that our work is an act of worship? We obey our earthly masters with fear and trembling, as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God. From the heart with a good will, rendering service as to the Lord and not to man. 4 times. 4 times Paul points Christian slaves and employers beyond their earthly master, their earthly employer, to God the Father through Christ the Son. Because for the Christian, all of life is worship. Which means for the Christian employee, all of work is what? It's worship. So examine yourself in this. Do you view your work as an offering of worship to God? And how would Tuesday be different if you did? Second, a brief word to Christian employers, to all those in a position of authority in the workplace. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Again, the underlying truth in this command is that the earthly master is in fact a slave of a heavenly master. The supremacy of Christ informs the way Christian masters, Christian employers relate to their slaves or their employees. So as we translate Paul's instructions out of the context of first century slavery and into the context of 21st century employment, the application to Christian employers is this: you are called to serve Christ by loving your employees. In all aspects of your management and supervision, you are to see your employee as a fellow image bearer, as being someone of immense value, possessing an immortal soul, worthy of your love and your care. How then should you approach your job tomorrow morning, Tuesday morning, and every morning? You should manage your employees reciprocally, doing the same to them. And I take Paul to mean that masters should treat their slaves the same way Paul instructed slaves to treat their masters, given the fact that one is in a position of authority and the other is in a position of subordination. Nevertheless, both are equally subordinate to the Lord Christ. So while the employer possesses a functional superiority over the employee, there is no inferiority or superiority, rather, of essence. No superiority in being. And an employer would do well to remember that. Your employee is worthy of respect and honor and goodwill, and not merely in public, but also in private. So examine yourself by this. Do you treat your employees in a way that demeans or belittles them? Or do you make them feel respected and honored in the workplace? Do you make decisions with their best interests at mind and not only the best interests of the bottom line? Do you view your job as a zero-sum scenario where you can only win if your employees lose? Or do you create an environment where when you win, when the company wins, everyone wins? Secondly, you should manage your employees equitably. By reminding masters that there is no partiality with God, Paul is exhorting masters that there should be no partiality with them. In the parallel instructions given to masters in Colossians 4:1, Paul says masters should treat their bondservants justly and fairly. And there's all manner of applications to this principle, from how you pay your employees, What's just and fair? What's just and fair is more work equals more pay. Higher quality equals higher pay. It extends to how you treat your employees with respect to one another, not giving preference to one employee over another on any other basis than merit. To how you enforce consequences on the job. Be clear, be consistent, and be compassionate. Masters must stop their threatening, a word that denotes physical violence, but in the context of our modern workplace might translate into the verbal abuse that some employers delight to heap upon their employees. So employers, examine yourselves in this. Of all the things your employees might say about you, and you can't control that, would they at least have to acknowledge that you are just and fair in your management of them? And third, you should manage your employees accountably, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So employers should remember that they stand in a position of delegated authority, that they will be held to account for how they have exercised that authority. Authority is a stewardship, and it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. So remember that, employers, when you go back to work this week, you will be held accountable for how you manage your employees. For the Christian, all of life is worship. That means for the Christian employer, all of management is worship as well. Now, underneath all of these instructions for how Christian slaves, employees, and Christian masters, employers, should relate to one another lies the fundamental truth that both the Christian slave and the Christian master are slaves of Christ. So as such, First Baptist Nixon, may we so live and work and manage in all of our life and work and management so that God is glorified through Jesus Christ our Lord.